Welcome, good evening. I'm Matthew Elisha. I am the president of the Jefferson Humanists, and we're really pleased to see you all here. Let me just tell you a little bit. Jefferson Humanists is the Jefferson County chapter of the American Humanist Association. We're a nonprofit secular organization dedicated to improving our society and community through rational and evidence-based thinking. Now, one of our core values is democracy, and the marketplace of ideas is an indispensable component to a vibrant democracy. I hope you'd all agree with that. Unfortunately, with the changes in our media, culture, and politics over the past couple of decades, that marketplace is eroding and may even be in danger of disappearing. For that reason, our chapter of Humanists is very pleased to sponsor tonight's debate, knowing that informed and courteous discussion of crucial issues is one of the best ways we can educate ourselves as citizens and uncover solutions that we can all live with. If at any time tonight you feel inspired by what we humanists do and want to join in the effort, please approach any of our chapter members. We're the ones that will have name tags. Actually, some of the others of you grab name tags, but we also have an information table at the back there. We're more than happy to give you more information and talk to you and tell you what we do. With that, I'd like to introduce you to the moderator for tonight's discussion. Ralph Hughes has been with our chapter for a couple of years now and has been very active in creating opportunities for our members to become more involved in the politics and economic policies that govern our lives. I'll let him frame the issues we'll be debating tonight and introduce the experts who will be speaking.
Thank you, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. In 1993, the average debt of a bachelor's degree graduate was approximately $9,000. 25 years later, Forbes magazine reports that figure is now 4 times that amount. Student loan debt is growing 12% a year and has now surpassed $1.5 trillion. That's 8% of our gross domestic product. 40% of people younger than 35 currently owe student loan debt, with an average for those borrowers ages 30 to 39 being $35,000. 1 out of 7 owes more than $50,000. I myself have a daughter-in-law who wanted to be a pediatrician. She has had to carry $250,000 of debt just to become a kid's doctor. So it's easy to find now interviews of young people where they describe their life situation as being debt slaves. The resulting financial stress of the next generation is causing them to delay getting married, buy homes, raise families. It's preventing them from starting businesses. Now, some pundits say skyrocketing student debt represents a failure of our society to nurture its young. They urge us to forgive much of this debt and reinvigorate government to change how higher education works. Other observers say that students freely took out these loans. They claim that we will undermine the notion of personal accountability if we simply erase that category of debt. Well, this sounds like a great debate. So let's have it. Yes or no on the following motion. Use government funding and regulation to reduce student debt back down to 1990s level. We'll have 2 teams who will explore this question for you tonight. I'll introduce them in a moment, but I want to tell you the structure of our conversation tonight. We'll let these 4 experts debate in 4 parts. The first part will be approximately 25 minutes, where we'll give each of them a 6-minute opening presentation. Then we'll do 20 minutes of questions that the 5 of us have prepared for each other. Then we'll do 15 minutes of questions from the audience, and then we'll close with 15 minutes of closing statements. Now, you all should have received a packet as you came in tonight. In there, I believe on the top, is a before debate ballot where you can register whether you agree with the motion at this time. Mark them now and in a moment we'll collect them. You should also have a form for submitting a question, if you choose to do so. We'll collect those forms after the opening statements, and when I get them up on stage, I'll ask as many of them as I have time for. Finally, you should also have an after-debate ballot. At the conclusion of our event, you'll vote again for whether you support the motion or not. The team that has persuaded more people to change their minds will be declared the victor, although in every sense, it will be civil discourse that wins tonight. There's also a survey on the after-debate ballot. Please use that to let us know how well we did in organizing this event. Now we'll collect the before-event ballots. To make the ballots easier to count, if you voted for the motion, please pass them to the left aisle. The folks with the name tags will gather them. If you voted against the motion, please pass them to the right. Okay, as we collect the ballots, let me introduce our four experts. Leading off the team speaking for the motion is JoyAnn Ruscha. She's a policy advisor, a commentator, and a longtime advocate of student debt relief. Her partner tonight is Jack Kroll, University of Colorado Regent, CU Boulder's Associate Director of Transfer Student Admissions, and a graduate student in finance. Speaking against the motion, we have Jimmy Sengenberger, President and CEO of the Millennial Policy Center, and also a Denver radio personality on 710 KNUS and KDMT 1690. His partner is Dr. Paul Prentice, Senior Fellow with the Independence Institute, a Fellow at the Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University, and an Associate Scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. Now, it's a brave thing to do, to come out and debate a complex topic against well-informed opponents before an audience that you don't know. So before moving on to opening statements, let's all take a moment to express our appreciation for the time and energy these four experts have put into tonight's presentation. All right, so with that, we're going to move to opening statements. Leading off will be JoyAnn Ruscha.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Sometimes being 5'2" is an occupational hazard. My name is JoyAnn Ruscha. I'm a policy advisor on issues that affect working families. I'm also a former teacher, and I've worked on education, policy, and equity nationally and here locally in Colorado. So I want to start by recognizing Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote, as a staunch advocate for the public funding of education, he wrote that an enlightened citizenry is indispensable for the proper functioning of a republic. Self-government is not possible unless citizens are educated sufficiently to enable them to exercise oversight. It is therefore imperative that the nation see to it that a suitable education be provided for all of its citizens. Just like the ancient philosophers of Greece, Jefferson recognized that access to education was critical to a functioning government. Indeed, the ability to reason is the greatest protection against tyranny. But what of the protection against inherited poverty, if that poverty restricts access to an education? The entrance gates to the University of Northern Colorado, my alma mater, are dedicated to Horace Mann. Mann believed that education should be universal, free, democratic, non-sectarian, and most importantly, open to all. Born in poverty in 1796, Mann would become what we call the father of the common school, otherwise known as our K-12 system. Mann believed, like Jefferson did, in the public funding of schools, but even more importantly, that education be open to all who desire it, regardless of social or economic status. In 1862, U.S. Representative Justin Morrill of Vermont, son of a blacksmith, was successful in the passage of the Morrill Act. This land grant bill, signed by President Abraham Lincoln, provided public funds for public universities that would educate the masses, the common people, primarily in the agricultural and mechanical sectors. The Morrill Bill was later expanded upon and strengthened over time. Colorado State University is a land-grant university made possible by the passage of this act. Similarly, Article 8, Sections 1 and 5 of the Colorado Constitution also outlines the duty of the state to establish institutions of higher learning for the purpose of the public good. Specifically, and I quote, University at Boulder, Colorado Springs and Denver, the University at Fort Collins, the School of Mines at Golden, and other such institutions of higher education, unquote. Today, that includes our state community colleges, local colleges, and public technical schools like Emily Griffith. The topic today is student loan debt. Americans are sitting on $1.5 trillion in student loans, with half unable to make the minimum requisite payment. The question posed was, should the government restore funding, and we assume this means in the form of grants, loans, and direct funding, to 1990s levels? Our team feels this is the wrong question to ask because the short answer is that 1990s funding is irrelevant. Should the state have ever permitted students to go into debt in the first place? After all, wealth transfer, or lack thereof, is one of the greatest indicators of poverty. The inability to pass on wealth creates cycles of poverty, things that our children and grandchildren are not necessarily responsible for. Horace Mann and other proponents of public education recognized this reality 200 years ago. Indeed, our current education system, from preschool to graduate school, is designated to mitigate socioeconomic disadvantages where it can. Thurgood Marshall was denied admittance at the University of Maryland Law School for the crime of being black. The future NAACP attorney and Supreme Court justice would later become one of the greatest jurists on the matter of educational equity. We are familiar with Brown versus the Board of Education and the recognized belief that separate but equal is unconstitutional. Likewise, we would be remiss to not point out that economic debates must be intersectional. The black-white wealth gap is fueled by student loan debt. Black college attendees generally have less wealth to draw from, taking on a larger share and therefore risk of the student loan debt burden. In addition, expensive and sometimes fraudulent for-profit colleges are more likely to target students of color. Women are also disproportionately affected, as we are the majority of student loan debt holders. The right to an education is a long-established American tradition. This defense of the common public good has been recognized in state and federal courts since our country's inception. We hold that where people cannot exercise their established rights and granted privileges to higher education, the state has a governmental obligation to intervene. With that, I will see the microphone. Thank you.
And who is speaking first? Okay, now we'll have Dr. Paul Prentice.
Thank you, Joy, for that introduction. I'm reminded of a headline that hasn't yet occurred, but it will eventually. World to end tomorrow, women and minorities affected most. So I'm not quite sure. There's so many places we could go with this debate, and it's kind of hard to keep it focused on something more precise that we can actually agree on. I want to start with where I think we do agree. I think we can all agree that student debt burden causes real hardship for those individuals who lack the repayment capacity. But that's not really the question. The question is, how did it happen? How did we get here? And if we're going to come up with some ideas as to how to get out of this mess, must we not first diagnose it and then provide a prescription related to that diagnosis? So I just remember being 18 years old, fresh out of high school, my summer year working really hard to put away enough money so I could attend a state university, the University of Connecticut, in 1964. While I was there, I worked part-time, worked all the vacations, worked the next summer, and so on through my college career. And I didn't take out a dime of student debt. I paid everything retail. And that worked really well for not just myself, but students in lower middle class, students in lower classes, all kinds of minorities, everybody could just afford. And you have to ask yourself, how and why can any kind of an institution create a pricing system that prices the majority of their customers out of that market. You've got to say, as an economist, there's something wrong. There was something wrong in that system, so let's make sure we diagnose it correctly so we can fix it instead of making it worse. So the history of student debt, actually, there's a legislation going back to 1958, revised in 1965, revised in 1968, revised every 5 to 10 years ever since, going back and forth on funding, on the amounts, on the type, and the way the system would work, because each time they do it, they would create problems that they didn't have to fix them with the next set of legislation. Because the policymakers seem to be completely not incapable, but uninterested in thinking through the impacts of their policies in terms of unintended consequences or following the incentives that are set up in those programs. So they're constantly having to go back and revise and revise and revise. And that just, as I went through that history of it, it just reminded me of a quote from one of my favorite economists from the Austrian School of Economics, Friedrich Hayek. He said the following in his Nobel Prize lecture. He said, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design." Because if you just think about the movie, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and Mickey Mouse up there, you know, with all the buckets going crazy and the mops, and the next thing you do, you push it over here and something happens over there, then you go to fix this over here and something happens over there. You cannot possibly design this kind of thing. So I think that's going to be the last time we'll agree on anything here, is that student debt is a big problem and a problem for the people. But I think in terms of analyzing how it got to be that problem and then doing something about it, we're going to have two very different ideas for you. The way I see it is that the massive amounts of subsidies into the educational system through the student loans and many other things has created artificial demand, which Econ 101 was guaranteed to raise the price. And then the price goes up, and you get a feedback loop into pushing more resources into it to meet the price. That drives the price higher. So that is how, in my opinion, as an economist, we got here. We get a system that is inflating at 6-7 times the annual rate of inflation in the U.S. economy. There's only two parts of the economy that are doing that. One is education, the other is healthcare. So they have that in common. They're inflating at massive amounts times the general inflation rate. But the other thing they have in common is massive amounts of government interference and government subsidies into those programs. So maybe if we just think about this and try to diagnose the problem, that's the problem. And if we take that away, maybe that'll be part of the solution. We'll get to some specifics with Jiminy in a few minutes. And I want to just warn everybody against the idea of moral hazard, which is what we call in economics. If somebody gets the benefits of anything, but then someone else has to pay for it, okay, we call that moral hazard. For example, if you build a house in the floodplain somewhere on the coast and you enjoy having a beachfront home in life, and then a hurricane comes up, and then the rest of you don't pay for that. The rest of the taxpayers pay for that mess. So moral hazard is replete in both the healthcare system and the educational system. And it is true, as Joy said, that education benefits a lot of people. Primarily, it benefits the student. I know, I went through education. I paid for it, and I got a lot of value out of it. So what happened between 1964 and today to make that unaffordable to the average human being? And I'm making the case that what happened was massive government subsidies, massive government inflation of the incentives program to it, even into the high school level, where high schools are now graded upon not just their graduation rate, but of those graduates, what percent goes to college? And that's part now fed back into the scoring system for the principals, for the administration. But they never ask how many of those actually graduate, or how many of those graduate and are able to pay back their student loan. So my solution would be to get as much government out of this as possible, to bring as much market forces as possible back into this, so it could be like it was for me and my generation. You work, you go to school, you get an education. You don't have to come out with a mortgage on your back. Okay, thank you.
And now we'll hear from a CU Regent, Jack Kroll.
Well, thank you, and good evening, everybody. Everyday Americans now hold over $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. This will cripple the bedrock of American democracy, which is, of course, middle-class citizens, if we continue to abdicate our social responsibility to fund education for all. Education is a right, plain and simple. Access to that right should go uninhibited. However, due to a growing lack of public support for higher education, many students must look to their own family's wealth to gain access and often retain access to America's middle class. Currently, too much of the burden of access to higher education rests on familial wealth. As such, the rich gain access while the lack of family wealth too often bars access to the poor and middle class. This household wealth gap, a usually benign product of capitalism, has now manifested as a pernicious force accelerating the educational inequities in America and must be stopped. This is because family wealth serves no greater purpose than to self-perpetuate, while education's purpose is to raise opportunities for all families. Education, when accessible, functions like the tide, raising all boats. In our current system, which is over-reliant on household resources, family wealth, like a canal, ends up functioning as a cipher on the public good, channeling the benefits to a privileged few. Because no matter how we slice it, American colleges and universities, both public and private, benefit significantly from federal and state funding. In fact, a study of the Pew Charitable Trust showed that in 2013, the total state and federal spending in higher education amounted to roughly $150 billion annually. Under our current debt-based system of education funding, a disproportionate amount of the benefits flow to the wealthy. Directly, the wealthy are already able to send their students to quality public schools or elementary and high school education, for elementary and high school education. Wealthy families, in addition, invest more capital and thus reap more of the benefits that innovation on our educational campuses spurs. Indirectly, however, we all benefit, including the wealthy, from the positive effects of education. This is because education, not money, is the greatest driving force in the creation of wealth in America. This is because education spurs innovation, and it is only innovation which can claim to be the intrinsic creator of wealth. Innovation would certainly occur in the absence of education, but education certainly accelerates it. When we view education as the primary driver of innovation, it must hold that in any society where they fail to educate its population, they rob themselves, as well as future generations, of the greatest asset any country or of the greatest asset any country can know, and that is, of course, human capital. Human capital is a sustainable, intergenerational, wealth-generating force beyond measure. And the dissemination of knowledge, widely and freely, is the greatest compounding force behind the growth in human capital and thus our standard of living. By limiting access to education, we place an upper bound on our return on human capital and thus suffer both long and short-term consequences. In our current system, which inadequately funds higher education from tax dollars, we substitute for a greater proliferation of human capital the short-term preservation of familial wealth, thus lower taxes. So far, I have presented the stark reality that many students are barred access to education due to costs. But let's take a hypothetical look in which students do receive a college education. Let's take, for example, two equally academically talented students who graduate with the same major from the same university. And now let's introduce one key difference. One student had to borrow to pay for the school, and the other did not. This leaves the borrowing student with less degree equity than the student who did not have to borrow. The erosion of equity represents another subsidy the wealthy gain from our current education system. That is, the percentage of their net wealth they need to commit to their education is significantly less than that of middle and lower income students. As such, we blunt the ability for education to serve as an equalizing force in our society. This blunting contributes to the erosion of America's middle class and the demise of the American dream. Moving forward, America cannot simply view education as a private good. The philosophies elevated as far back as Ronald Reagan had led us astray. There is no debate. Education is both a public and a private good. However, the benefits of education to the public well-being far surpass those to the private citizen. We already accept this as true and guarantee a high school education to all citizens. It's time we go further. We must return America to student debt levels seen in the 1990s at the bare minimum. Debt hinders economic growth. Every major recession, as well as the Great Depression, was preceded by a significant run-up in household debt. As debt rises, consumption will fall. When consumption falls far enough, growth slows or reverses altogether. Debt imbalances the playing field between the wealthy and the middle and lower class. Students deserve the opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, work hard, and get ahead. But if we don't give them boots to wear, they cannot do this. Excessive college debt hinders the productivity of our workforce and stifles innovation. Congress understood this issue when it created the original and most recent GI bills, which effectively allow men and women transitioning out of the service to go to college for free. These bills were created to function not as a handout, but a hand up. In 2008, Peter Gayton, the American Legion's Veteran Affairs Director, stated to CBS News, what the GI Bill originally did was allow them to go to school, to purchase their home, to become part of the workforce when they took their uniform off. We must confront the reality that a high school education is no longer sufficient to keep pace in a global economy. America needs an increasingly more productive workforce to maintain its position as the greatest civilization ever known. China now produces 8.2 million college graduates every year. This is up from just 1 million in 2001. In comparison, the U.S. produced just 1.9 college graduates in 2018. We must act now to stop student debt from eroding our democracy and our innovative capacity and preserve our status as the greatest country ever known.
And thank you. And our final opening statement will be Jimmy Sengenberger.
Good evening. August 2nd, 1990, I was born. And if you ask my parents, they will tell you, or they'll say to me, you know, the day Iraq invaded Kuwait, Jimmy, you invaded our lives. Now, they're here tonight, so you can talk to them about just how much they clearly love their son. Their oldest, might I add. Now, that year, though, 1990, student loan debt totaled about $25 billion total. Now we are at $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. That is astronomical. And it's interesting to me, especially based on what Dr. Paul Prentice said earlier about the causes for this, with which I wholeheartedly agree, that just a few years before I was born and before this 1990s level, then Secretary of Education Bill Bennett said, and I quote, "Increases in financial aid in recent years have enabled colleges and universities blithely to raise their tuitions, confident that federal loan subsidies would help cushion the increase." It became known as the Bennett hypothesis, and it has borne out over the last 3+ decades. There is no doubt that the student loan burden is astronomical. I myself continue to carry $16,000 in student loan debt. Now, this is significantly less than what I came out of Regis University for, and I will admit as well that I did choose a private school. That was my choice. I made that decision. Now I'm continuing to pay the debt, and there have been some points in my not too far back history where I also had to achieve forbearances as well, meaning I would rack up interest on the loan debt, but I wasn't making payments. It was permitted for a set number of months. I understand, as a nonprofit president and an early-time radio host, I understand the struggles of trying to pay month by month for student loan debt. But the idea of just having some sort of a government alternative, or rather government solution, say forgiving student loan debt or canceling it now, or maybe trying to do some sort of a regulatory strategy, strikes me as far more problematic, not addressing the fundamental issues, and something that really won't advance the cause of a better educated population. I think that what we really need to be looking at, and I want to specifically propose a few ideas, is an alternative that really is much more focused on helping the people who need it most to address the issue of the overwhelming, deep burden that you may have at times of student loan debt, and alternatively, those who are trying to make payments month by month. So I would start, for example, with restoring bankruptcy discharge protection. You see, up until about the 1970s, you could discharge your student loan debt in bankruptcy. That changed. And as a result of that changing, risk was no longer incumbent upon the lender. They didn't have to worry as much. And now we're at a point where some have said that it's easier to get a student loan than it is to get into college. That has exacerbated the cost crisis that we now see in higher education. And so if you were to look at somebody who's deeply burdened by student loan debt, that they are overwhelmed, there's no way out, a big reason for this is because they can't discharge it unless they have an undue burden, and even then the standard is extremely, extremely limited. The only other form of debt, by the way, in America that you cannot discharge is IRS debt. It is abominable that we have this system. If we were to re-permit, to restore the idea of bankruptcy protection for student loan debt, not only would you help those who are ready to default, or maybe have defaulted, to get rid of that debt in a sense, through a process of bankruptcy, and yes, face the consequences of bankruptcy, but you'd also restore risk to the lender so they will be more responsible in providing those loans. And then what I would suggest as well is a third component, restoring risk to the institutions of higher education. For example, I would say that for future loans that are put out, students that go to an institution, if they end up discharging their loans, student loans in bankruptcy, that institution, so whatever the college is, CU, CSU, Regis, whatever it is, they would be on the hook for, let's say, 5% of the losses. This means that you have skin in the game from the student and some consequences if they do declare bankruptcy. But more importantly, you restore risk to the lender and you restore risk to the higher education institutions so they will be more responsible when they are dealing with the cost of higher education and addressing all those different factors and what they provide for their degree. In addition, Colorado Senator Cory Gardner late last year put forward the Student Loan Repayment Acceleration Act. What this would do in part is provide a way for employers and employees to pay in tax-free up to $10,000 a year into a 401k-like system where you would be able to extract the money from that tax-free again and use it to pay down student loan debt each month. Now, I talked to a deeply indebted college student who's about to graduate college who has over 6 figures in student loan debt, has a job, thankfully, right out of college when she graduates, but will be, as part of that job, be able to get access to a retirement account. But she said, if this is actually something that I had the opportunity to use, instead of the 401k retirement plan, I would go for it right away because paying down that debt is important. You maintain by doing this the personal responsibility of the individuals who made the decision to take out the loan, and then at the same time you make sure that the economics are in check, that it's not overwhelmingly costing on the society and on the people of the country, because $1.5 trillion is very expensive. And you also provide great opportunities for people to be able to make those payments more effectively. It's a moral way to go, economically sound, and, my friends, I think it is the most prudent way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. So we're going to move into the second portion of our debate this evening, which is where we're going to exchange some questions. First, we'll do it up here on stage, and then we would like to ask some of the questions submitted by the audience. So at this time, you've heard the opening presentations. It should have brought up some questions in your mind. If you've jotted them down on that paper, you can pass them to the aisle. If it's a question for the team that's supporting the motion, please pass them to your left. If it's a question for the team speaking against the motion, please pass them to your right. And as soon as I get them up on stage here, I'll ask as many as I can. Let me kick it off by giving a quick synopsis of the arguments that we heard so far. JoyAnn mentioned that higher education is a constitutional obligation to at least the state of Colorado that's obviously not being filled if this debt is starting to skyrocket. And she warned us about cycles of poverty, that if we can't educate the disadvantaged, they will stay disadvantaged. Dr. Prentice asked, how did we get here? And his diagnosis was a poorly designed mechanism. He pointed out that if you pump state money into an institution without some kind of mechanism to guard for value, prices will just go up. And he warned us that if you just pay for something outright without bounds, you're going to end up with a moral hazard, such as people living on the coast and relying on the government to fix their homes when the hurricane hits. Jack then said, we need to have uninhibited access to education. If you don't, then all you're doing is protecting the familial wealth rather than investing in the future of the society. And he asked, what happens if we don't maintain human capital? Do we start to fall behind countries such as China? And then Jimmy wrapped it up by saying, it's time to go further. Oh, well, Jack also mentioned it was time to go further than high school education, that we need to consider post-secondary education as a requirement to function adequately in the society. And then Jimmy said, it may be a bad idea just to forgive the debt, but how about some restructuring of the institutions? Roll the bankruptcy law back so that you could discharge the debt, restore the risk to the lender who's making the student loans, and restore the risk to the colleges. So with that, I would like to ask a couple questions to get the ball rolling, and then let the panels ask questions of each other. And we are going to go. Okay, so my first question is for the team speaking for the proposition that we need to use government funding and regulation to reduce student debt back down to a level last seen in the 1990s. And my question is, what I gathered from your presentations was that there should be unlimited access to education. As a taxpayer, that might make one nervous. So the question really is, do we just give everybody all the education they could possibly want? That does seem to open up the danger of exploding education costs even beyond what we have now. How would you answer that concern of a taxpayer?
So, money should not inhibit a student's ability to access higher education. I think what we would say to the taxpayers is this. We know that an educated workforce produces higher incomes, which then produces a broader tax base, which allows these things to pay for itself. It is quite literally the opposite argument that the folks on the right might say about cutting taxes. Well, you cut taxes, you spur economic development, and then you then actually increase the tax base. What we're saying is create greater opportunities for educational expenditures beyond high school by the government to allow every individual to realize their fullest human capital, and that in return will produce a greater educated workforce that will in turn increase the resources available to society.
Just briefly, I think the question you'd asked was, should the taxpayer be on the hook for individuals getting all the education they could want? So I'd like to reframe that a little bit. We're talking about education as a human need. And I mean, my son, who's in the audience, is 14 years old. Sometimes he doesn't want to be in class, but he needs to be in class. So I just wanted to point out that subtle difference there, is that our argument is that education is also it's a public good because it's a public need, and this is why we need to fund it, not just in the form of student loans, but also funding our educational systems, particularly public education. So a lot of the proposals regarding a free college education talks about our public, state, and college systems. That those mandates are unfunded mandates as they are right now, which, as our colleague Paul pointed out, does help drive up the cost on the student loan debt side.
Can I put a little finer point to my question? Sure. I studied economics when I was in college, and if there was a impetus for the state to provide all the education that people want, couldn't we end up with tens of thousands of economists and no engineers? Doesn't the state need to guide how that money is being spent? It seems to me that all the education the public could want has some inherent dangers if not managed. And that's what I was asking. What mechanisms would you suggest to ensure the taxpayer that they get the money, their money's worth out of the money they put into education?
I think you raise a valid concern in that we simply can't allow, for 10,000 economists, that's a scary proposition. But the reality is what we currently have right now, because institutions are so dependent on tuition revenue to maintain their balances, their balance sheet, what you have is you have a lot of program duplication, because everybody needs to offer certain degrees to attract students, such as, for the Boulder campus, actually, economics is the most popular undergraduate major in the College of Arts and Sciences outside of our health sciences programs. So what you can do in a system where the government has more control over who's getting these resources, you can actually drive down costs because you're not duplicating programs. In addition to that, what we've seen in the world of admissions, as you mentioned, I work in admissions at CU Boulder, is that universities have spent massive amounts of money on things like $100 million football stadiums or 13 different dining options for lunch, or lazy rivers in residence halls so they can attract students. That is conspicuous consumption driven by the fact that we've created market forces or introduced unnecessary market forces by failing to adequately fund higher education from a government's perspective.
Very good, thank you. My next question is for the team speaking against the motion. If we compare the United States to Europe, we see a marked difference in the way we fund education. The U.S. has the highest average tuition costs of 35 OECD member countries, about $9,000 a year for tuition. A third of the countries in Europe, including Denmark and Finland, don't charge any tuition fees at all for public institutions at the bachelor level. And then in 10 countries, such as Austria, Italy, and the Netherlands, the tuition fees are less than half of what the U.S. charges. And they seem to be able to educate their young, and they don't have this extreme burden of debt ending up on their young generation's shoulders. So my question is, your team cited that we're putting too much money into education, and I'm wondering, is that really the problem? Isn't it the problem the way we're putting money into it, that we're using the loans to individuals and giving individuals as many loans as they want or as they dare to take, rather than sending that money directly to the universities?
In some ways, yes. I think Jack just said that we've somehow introduced market forces. If you want to call it market forces, we've perverted the market forces in the higher education system because, for example, for decades there's been no risk to the lender in giving out these loans. I mean, it's fundamentally flawed to think that what you're looking at with the higher education system today is something where you actually see the free market at work or something along those lines. It really isn't the case. I mean, just case in point, all of my loans are through the government. I don't have private sector loans. I have government-provided loans from the Federal Department of Education. In addition, when we're looking at kind of the structure of the system, if we look at the root cause of where we're at now, we're at a significantly higher position in terms of the cost of higher education and the student loan debt burden than we were decades ago, and even within the last decade. I mean, it's gone up markedly. The reasons for that specifically are because of the fact that you don't have a risk to the lender, as I said, but especially also any risks to the institutions of higher education, which is why I think the fundamental way in which we address this problem is to look at the real economics. It's not through some sort of a government provision in a country that has much larger populations, by the way, than many of the OECD countries that you're talking about, especially Denmark and so forth. I mean, these are not very large countries, especially by population. I think that is an important thing to look at when we're looking at these massive government programs that people are talking about these days. But also, the idea of managing education choices. I mean, I think that you should be looking at a system where you don't have the government telling you, oh, you can study this major or you can't study that major or something like that. I don't like micromanagement, but I do think that market forces should play a role. So maybe that degree in underwater basket weaving is one that you discourage instead of saying, let's go ahead and do that one. Look for maybe more of the productive ones and help to guide a bit at an institutional level, not at a government level. So those are a couple of my thoughts. Paul, something to add?
So you basically brought up the idea that the European model, or moving towards Joy's idea of free or fully subsidized education, would somehow be a better outcome. I just want to remind Jack of what Jimmy said, that government spending is not what we call market forces. And the idea of this utopian ideal that just going to college makes you better off and guarantees you a better job, when the data show quite the opposite. The data show that most college graduates can't even get a job to pay back their debt. So there's kind of an internal contradiction in the logic there. And then the other thing is that high school graduates, if we'd taken that $1.5 trillion and put it into vocational education training, and we'd have more diesel mechanics and more pipe fitters and more people coming out of high school earning $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year in the building trades, where we really need those jobs. So that's an option as well. That money didn't come free of opportunity cost, as every dollar spent through this government subsidized program is a dollar that couldn't generate wealth somewhere else in the economy, and it's not automatic that that was the best use of that capital. Now back to the European example, if you wish to go to that kind of an economy, that's a completely different discussion, and probably we should have that at some point. But the fact of the matter is, those economies that do that, in general, not each one, but in general, the European economies have a standard of living 1/3 less than ours. They have a youth unemployment rate of 5 to 6 times ours. They have very, very little opportunities for growth personally, and growth in the economy and growth in business. So if you want to go to that, that's fine, but you have to know where you're going. And eventually Sweden will become Venezuela if they keep going that way, and we will too. There's just no way out. That's just simple logic. So I'm just arguing that if we just want to focus on the student debt issue, let's identify the problem. The problem is inflated demand because of government subsidized through this loan programs. I didn't have any of that when I was in college, and it worked just fine for all of myself and my friends, my poor friends, my rich friends, everybody. And I don't like this idea of what Jack brought up, this rich versus poor and redistributing wealth. And I knew it wouldn't take you guys long to go there, but I'd rather not, because that's not the purpose of tonight.
Super. So let me open it up to the two tables here. You have questions for each other? Go. You sure can. We'll let the pro table ask the first question.
So thank you. That was a lot. That was a lot to unpack, and we'll try not to go down or go off of a time cliff here in addressing all of those points. But there are a couple of things I do want to point out, talking about the need for certain what's the phrase I'm thinking of, Jack? The need for our plumbers, our pipe fitters, our nurses, our teachers, etc. That also do contribute to the common good and also fulfill a need as far as job creation. And I want to take us, or our position here is to move away from the classist argument that post high school education has tiers, meaning that if you go to school to become a doctor, that you don't necessarily have a greater value than someone who joined an apprenticeship program and became a pipe fitter. And so we also would argue that public funding of our educational systems should be expanded to those programs. I did not get a degree in underwater basket weaving, but I was the person who took it upon themselves to become a teacher after high school. And I had $30,000 easily in student loan debt, which as a teacher I only had to increase that burden by getting additional certifications. What we also would argue is that we want to, whenever possible, mitigate that debt burden by providing funding for these programs in advance, particularly when society sees a benefit to having these professionals. So teachers, instead of asking our teachers to go to a four-year university and take on this debt, and having debt also impacts your daily financial realities, that we would instead relieve teachers, nurses, firefighters of their debt burden to begin with by paying for that up front. If we are all kind of assuming that the individual is going to have some responsibility for debt. The point about, I think, debt forgiveness or loan forgiveness programs, my colleague Jack could probably talk to that more, but they don't work. Most applications after serving in public service, for 10 years and you apply for your debt forgiveness, are rejected. And again, this is from our perspective, what we're arguing for is, oh, did you ding me? Okay.
Let's
the investment versus taking on the debt later.
Let's give the team speaking against the motion a chance to respond.
A couple of things. First of all, I appreciate the reference to the common good. I'm a Catholic who went to Regis University, so that's very welcome. One of the other things that I've done in the nonprofit world has been running a program teaching fifth graders the principles of American government and the U.S. Constitution, and so I've worked intimately with teachers and provided them with resources and gone and spoken into classes, and I think, first of all, that it is unfortunate that we, in many cases, including, I think, in so many school districts in Colorado, underpay our teachers, and we should be looking at restructuring some of the ways that the districts finance K through 12 education. So with that in mind, and my understanding of the value of public education as a product of public school until I went to Regis University, and someone who really appreciates and admires fifth grade teachers especially, because that's near and dear to my heart, but all teachers. I agree that there is a phenomenal benefit to making sure that teachers and others are able to do their job and get compensated well for it. But the curious questions that come up in my mind is, first of all, when you talk about society seeing a benefit, how do you determine whether or not society sees a benefit to something, and which degrees should be subsidized by the government more than other degrees? I mean, if you're not going to just subsidize everything absolutely equally, or you're going to be handpicking those that are more beneficial than others, I'd be curious to figure out who gets to make that determination. Moreover, I'm very curious as to the specifics that the other side would put forward as far as especially addressing the student loan burden, but maybe broadly speaking, since you've been talking a little bit about funding education more, maybe providing free college, what that specifically would look like. I know that I addressed the student loan issue particularly, but I haven't heard anything very precise in terms of a policy proposal from you guys.
Just got a couple things to follow up here. Do we?
Please.
Okay, yeah. Who's this mysterious we you keep referring to? Not sure who that is. I'd prefer to think of society as made up of individuals with their own choices and their own values, not subject to some sort of government coercion. That's just my philosophy. When we talk about free public education, or free higher education at least, universities and colleges, you really mean free of charge, because it can't be free. And I'd just like to paraphrase a political commentator who said something close to this, that if you think public education is expensive now, wait till you see what it costs when it's free. Because you have to think of the opportunity cost of all of those resources. And not one thing you have said or presented has attacked and dealt with the very problem that how is it that you've developed a system where you price your service beyond your customer's ability to pay? How is that even possible in a system of logical economics? You have to look at the root cause, and you haven't really addressed that.
So directly to respond to your last question, 50% of students at the University of Colorado don't borrow at all. That means that those students who are borrowing are subsidizing their education, and they're paying ultimately a higher price. So what I'm arguing for is that everybody pays an equal price, and at this moment in time, not having to put additional resources of your family's wealth into it is a benefit for society. That is a benefit we have all recognized at the elementary and the secondary level. It is time that we take that additional step and go further. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions from our perspective. You know, Jimmy, you introduced this idea that we should allow for the discharge in bankruptcy. It's seemingly a good idea, but does not that then incur or encourage more additional borrowing, since you know that you can get rid of it, and then as well as tax-free proposals for paying off student loan debt? Does that not actually then decrease the cost of borrowing, thus encouraging more borrowing?
Interesting questions. First of all, in terms of the bankruptcy protection, no, I think that history shows that we started to see the skyrocketing cost of college education really traces its way back to the late 70s, and that's about the time when we eliminated, or pretty much eliminated, the ability to discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy. I think that the biggest reason why it would discourage borrowing in some levels is because there's going to be a risk to the lender. Now, hopefully we can also scale back the government give out of student loans so that there's more private parties that are engaged in that activity. But even if it's the government or otherwise, having the lender hold some risk, and especially as well holding some risk upon in my proposal, higher education institutions, where if you discharge your student loans in bankruptcy and you went to CU Boulder would have to pay back 5% of the losses on that loan. That means that the institutions are going to have to make sure that they are providing the highest quality education with degrees that are especially beneficial to people, and that is very important, I think, to include into the system. Now, as for the student loan support through tax-free accounts or something like that, we're talking about a benefit provided, for example, by employers or other ways to make it easier to pay back your debt. So in the employer position, for example, under Senator Cory Gardner's bill, the Student Loan Repayment Acceleration Act, what you would do is the company would set up these accounts, and they would be tax-free accounts. Company could put in, say, 50-50. 50% from the company if the employee puts in 50%, up to $10,000. That is a benefit that's provided by the company. That is a form of compensation from the company. And so you're actually just simply making it easier for the individual to pay that back, and I think that makes it a far more practical way to go. Now, I do think there are more provisions to Senator Gardner's bill that we could delve into, and other ways that I might tweak it, but I think something along those lines would be beneficial as far as repayment of the debt when it's still incumbent upon the individual, not simply me asking all of you to pay back my debt.
Okay, very good. Let me try to get some of the questions from the audience into the mix here. Elijah asked, what effect does student debt have on the economy? Well, that's an important question. What is the cost so far? I wanted to bring to your attention the two macroeconomic models that I put in the information packets that we shared in preparing for this debate, which was two models prepared by Ray Fairs and Moody's, gave a 10-year forecast of the impact of just canceling all the student debt. The three things that they cited was it would boost real GDP by an average of 86 to 108 billion per year. It would reduce average unemployment by 0.25% to 1/3 percentage point, and it would add between 1.2 and 1.5 million new jobs per year. So I think that makes Elijah's question pertinent, which is, what is the cost of going on and doing nothing to stop this student debt? Even if it costs us a bunch to just forgive the debt, wouldn't we come out ahead?
Sure. How about we just think about forgetting the student debt? How about just forgiving all automobile debt? How does that work? Does that stimulate the economy? I mean, what's the difference here? Forgive all mortgage debt. Does that stimulate the economy? I know Professor Ray Fair. I know him personally, and I use his macro model actually for 30 years in my consulting business, so I know the Fair model very well. And it's flawed in the sense that it'll always show benefits to government programs, but never shows you the true cost, because it can't measure the opportunity cost of those resources. So that 1.5 trillion, if we were to just forgive it, where's that go? That's wrapped up in people's bond portfolios. That goes to investors who have saved all their lives, and maybe it's who knows who it is. But it's not free. You can't just say, well, never mind. We're just joking. And then 1.5 trillion of capital just goes poof. Every dollar of that is a dollar that could have done something else, but it was forced by government mandate, government edict into the educational system, and that caused everyone to raise their prices, and that caused everyone to push more money into the system. It is a very, very dangerous negative spiral there. And I think until we address that, we'll never get anywhere.
Did you want to rebut that, JoyAnn?
Sure. I think when I say we, by the way, I'm talking about Jack and I, not a proverbial we. But I mean, to be very clear, we did just forgive about over $1 trillion of someone's economic responsibility, and that was the recent Republican tax cuts. And these were corporate tax cuts that were supposed to invigorate the middle class, and they have yet to materialize. So I think what you're seeing between our two tables is, again, just the concept of the social responsibility. When does the government have a duty to step in, and when does it not? And we've kind of we've exhausted our argument on the government responsibility aspect, but I also just want to, again, recognize and point out that the education debt debate is a component of a larger conversation about what has happened to the American middle class. It has shrunk, partially because of costs, also because of automation, a rapidly changing 21st century economy. We recognize that, but letting the student loan debt burden continue as it is without addressing it is also pushing us off, I think, a fiscal cliff. When you cannot pay for healthcare costs because you are under a income-based loan repayment program paying 15% of your income towards your student loan debt, that is a societal concern, right? Not just an individual one. When people cannot save for retirement, that also becomes a societal concern. When people cannot create businesses or start families or buy a home, these are also our concerns. So recognizing that we have radically philosophical different approaches to the role of government, I think even just looking at the pure economic perspective, what would you do with $1.5 trillion? It is not as though the government does not exercise and answer that question.
I really want to jump in there on a couple of things. First of all, there's
really is no, with all due respect, JoyAnn, there's really no comparison between the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and any proposals relative to student loan debt, and we could certainly discuss that. Also, you want to talk about health care. I can't afford Obamacare. I don't have health insurance because of the way that the current system is. I think we need to, it's the same problem as Dr. Prentice, as Paul identified before with health care, and we could delve into that if we wanted to, but it's another debate, that you have a structural system that is set up in a way that is completely disjointed because of government and how the government sets up its involvement in, and this goes back to the McCarran-Ferguson Act in the 1940s and so many other components. And then also to Paul's point about, really it's what Friedrich Bastiat, the great philosopher-economist, called the seen and the unseen. I mean, you can point out like this Ray Fair model and say, okay, well, if we put money this way, then we're going to see these results. Well, what else might have been done with that money in the economy? It's the flawed broken window theory, where if I go up to this school and I break the window, I just created some jobs or provided new economic opportunity because somebody's going to have to come back here and fix it. But what else could the school have done with that money, just in a hypothetical scenario? So it's very important to make sure that we keep in mind that you may see certain results, but that doesn't mean that there are unseen consequences to that. And then one other thing that I would be very curious to know is, if we're talking about the $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, the big question will be, do we forgive all of it? Do we tax that forgiveness? Because traditionally, when you forgive debt, that is taxable. Is it undergraduate only? Why not higher levels of education, like people who have master's programs or all the doctors that are out there? So all graduates or public school graduates? Is it people who've gone to CEU and CSU, or are we going to be able to provide it to private education? I mean, am I going to be chopped liver? That's going to be the key question, I think, here when you're talking about forgiveness, is how you actually structure those programs and try to address it. So those are a few thoughts.
Very good.
I would just jump in and say to your point, Jimmy, that there is actually a significant link between the tax cut and a proposal to forgive debt. It is, to Paul's point, it's simply opportunity cost. That was money that was going to flow into the government, and we decided when, and we in this case means the U.S. Congress, I certainly didn't support it. There were a couple things about higher education that I think were interesting about that I could get behind. We've decided simply as a society, when we passed that tax cut, that the corporations could spend that money more wisely. Right now, I would disagree with that assessment. I would say we could forgive a lot of debt for everyday Americans, and that would go much further than giving the benefit away to corporations. I do have one question for the other side, and this is something we hear quite frequently, and we being JoyAnn and I down at the Capitol, is legislators come up to us and say, we're going to cut higher education because we know you guys can just raise tuition. So currently we're failing to fund higher education at a sufficient enough level that we have to go to tuition increases, which in turn puts students into debt. So what would you say to a legislature who argues we should cut, say, COF, which goes to students at private universities, it's the state voucher system, that we should just cut COF because institutions can raise tuition?
Well, I would just say in general that the more government we get out of education, the better education we will have at lower prices. That's just the way the world works. I want to thank Jack for sure for correcting my data here, that 50% of CU students don't borrow, so you've only priced half your population out of the market. With respect to JoyAnn's comment about the economy, we had 10 years of an average GDP growth of 1.5% following those bank bailouts. Forgiveness of all of that debt, and that's the worst economy we've ever had since the Great Depression. And we're now at 4% GDP growth, and the current tax cuts have paid for themselves not in 2 to 3 years, but in the very first year of their existence. So there's a lot to that kind of data. And then finally, I think Jack had used the word in context of a tax cut that you're giving a benefit. So I just want to ask yourself in the audience, if you have $100 in your pocket and a man gets you in the back alley and he intends to steal 100 but only steals 50, did he give you a $50 benefit? Is a tax cut really a benefit, or is a failure to steal a benefit? So
I have a specific answer to Jack's question. I would say first, money I earn is principally my money first, indeed, and then it goes to the government when I'm taxed, and hopefully taxed not at a ridiculously high level. I actually would do something that would be very dramatic. I would eliminate all direct funding for all schools in the state, and I would switch to a model that would be an expanded variation of the Colorado's College Opportunity Fund. In fact, outside you'll find a couple of papers that I've written that you can delve into these different ideas. But I would actually take this program that provides a stipend for specific circumstances and certain amounts. You get more when you go to public schools than to private schools. I would equalize that amount. But I would get away from the current structure of direct, and there's a mix of the two, but I would principally get rid of the direct fee-for-service model. That's where, as I wrote here, the state directly funds public colleges and universities to a more effective approach, in my view, which emphasizes student choice, but incentivizes state colleges and universities to be more fiscally responsible. I would expand this program, provide more stipends to people, and be able to equalize where it all goes. I think that when you put the person in charge, of where they're going to be spending their money. That's going to be far more effective. I do support some sort of models like that in a variety of areas, including both levels of education. And so I could certainly delve into that more. And actually, it would be a very interesting conversation I'd love to have with the CE Regent, with Jack, because of the implications there, of course,
Good.
on those
It sounds like the
systems.
conversation will continue in the lobby afterwards. Let me get a couple more questions in here. Combine the two questions for the team speaking in support of the motion. Bob and Cheryl asked, and I'm going to read the two questions in sequence here. If you're going to give all of the education that people could want, what budgets would you cut to pay for that increasing cost of education? And then Cheryl follows up by saying, Senator Elizabeth Warren has proposed a wealth tax for billionaires. Do you think that would be a good way to provide this student debt relief?
I would absolutely be in favor of taxing the wealthy to fund higher education. That comes back to the point I made earlier about who benefits the most from our current educational system. And it's clear to me, given the relative cost differences when you factor in the debt loads, that the wealthy benefit significantly more under our current system for paying for higher education from their degree equity than do students from lower income backgrounds. As far as what other areas would we look to cut as far as to pay for higher education, I think that's a challenge. I think you look at the city of Denver right now, and students are being taught by effectively scabbed teachers, and it's tough because you have educators out there looking for a greater slice of the pie. What we need to do as a society is increase the size of the pie for all of our students. Simply put, America's ability to innovate is the reason why we are the most powerful nation the world has ever seen. And if we limit our ability to innovate by limiting the higher levels of human capital individuals can achieve in this country, we will, over the long run, erode our position.
Go ahead.
To the point about the pie and the growth of the GDP, the average American family hasn't seen much of that trickle-down benefit. It's not that we need to cut other services to provide funding for education or higher education. It's that we need to think about what we're going to do with not just tax revenue, but potential tax revenue. So I'm in agreement with Jack that yes, I would support a proposal such as Warren's, and yes, some of that should be allocated towards education costs. And Jimmy, I feel you about not being able to afford health care. I get my son's EpiPens from Canada illegally, but the reason why you can't afford health care is because Congress has yet to decide that it should be very hard for anyone to make billions of dollars off of sick Americans. Understanding we're not getting into a debate about health care, but you've brought it up a few times on that side of the table. For-profit insurance companies were prohibited until, I believe, the 60s. And right now in our education system, which kind of mirrors in some ways our healthcare system, we have these multi-tiered systems of access that are not equitable, that is somewhat private, somewhat commodity-driven, and also there is some government regulation and spending. If you want to propose a complete voucher system in which it's every person for themselves, and you get a little bit of money to attend a university, college, or technical school, and that's that, we're going to go back to where we were 200 years ago or 300 years ago, in even more rapidly, and where only those with wealth can access wealth. The whole purpose of having a publicly funded education system was for the public good.
Super. Now let me give the table speaking against the motion a chance to rebut that quickly, and then we'll move on to closing statements.
Well, one thing I would note is that I didn't say eliminate all government support for education programs in the higher education field at all, so therefore I don't think we would be really going back to 200, 300 years ago. Also, I do think that if you incorporate competition into the system, as I've what I've suggested would really do that. I think that you can help drive down costs. Also, well, I won't get into the debate under why I think there's no such thing as trickle-down economics, but we can talk about that another time. That'd be interesting as well. I would also say this, that very important in my mind, that we recognize that indeed there is a need for a well-educated population. But we also have to recognize that innovation doesn't come from government-guided policy. Innovation doesn't come because you went into the professorial classroom and got some good ideas from your professor, although I'm certainly the beneficiary of a wonderful, wonderful public and then private college education. Innovation does come from the individual. It is the individual who primarily benefits from the education. That's how you have all the different things that have been, not all of them, but the majority of technologies that have been innovative and creative and bettering our lives. That has come from people taking individual initiative. And yes, oftentimes going to wealthier people and saying, hey, will you take a risk on me? I'm looking for maybe $10 million, and you'll basically have ownership in the company, and then as the company grows, you will have more of an interest in that because financially you'll be in a good position. These people take risks with their money. They don't just hoard it, and that's all they do.
You have a minute?
Sure.
Okay, just a couple quick things just to think about. Wages rose 3.5% in the previous year, the fastest growth of wages in over 20 years, so I'm not sure where Joy gets her data. The other thing is just remember that demand is infinite at zero price. So where is all this money going to come from? There's not enough out there to steal to pay for these kind of ideas. And steal it is, because if you think about what Jack's proposing, or Joy, a tax rate to what, 70% or more, the highest marginal tax rates, how do you enforce that? You must enforce that at gunpoint, am I not correct? Okay, that's not volunteered money. So I would just ask you, please, please, kindly, put your guns away. Take your hands out of our pockets and leave us alone. We will solve this problem. Thank you.
All right, super. Well, that concludes the question portion of our debate. We're going to move on now to closing statements. We're going to give each speaker 4 minutes to wrap it up, and we'll go in the same order that we presented the opening statements. So, JoyAnn, you're first. Yeah, please come on.
Well, Paul is a bleeding heart liberal. I'm heartened to believe that you also believe in sensible gun control. The American dream is based on the idea that anyone from any place can thrive in a country that rewards hard work, a dream I think that all 4 of us, 5 of us, still believe in. But again, I would be at fault if I didn't point out that this idea has been driven by and for largely white American families and European immigrants. Again, these discussions about economic equity and wealth and educational equity, they must be intersectional, and they are much, much more complicated, as you could see, for us to be able to tackle in 20 minutes. This debate and panel has been very engaging, and I think we should all probably make sure we catch a drink or dinner sometime. And if only our greatest deliberative body, Congress, could engage in policy debates in the same manner, we might actually be able to solve more. Upward mobility in American society is not a linear trajectory. Free college alone can't fix employment discrimination or economic racism. Forgiveness of student loan debt can't adequately mitigate the commodity-driven public education system that we see today in our public colleges and universities. And guaranteeing that every child could have access to a public college doesn't change the reality of automation or a rapidly changing 21st century economy. My colleague, Jack, who's a regent for the University of Colorado, who's also responsible for setting the budget for our state's largest employer. He knows all too well the pain of unfunded mandates. In fact, as a policy advocate and someone who works the Capitol, I've occasionally called Jack and asked him if we could change the law and give him an unfunded mandate. But when government funding of public universities decrease, as we pointed out, boards are forced to make up for the difference in tuition. And with that comes marketing. And that marketing, of course, is driven by and towards a populace that can afford to pay for those costs. But the actual subsidies are coming from students without access. So this is, again, the result of a state or a government that is neglecting its duty to fund the systems we created. We did not delve in too much the difference between public and private universities, but at the very least, we need to reinvest into our public institutions of knowledge so that we can adequately reap those benefits. It is not, it's not economically sound, nor is it the government's interest in saddling the debt load burden post-education. We need to reduce that debt load burden by adequately investing into our higher education systems. So the failure to act in the past is not cause for inaction today. The $1.5 trillion in student loan debt is a fiscal cliff that impacts all of us. And just because the answers might be complicated or multifaceted as far as policy solutions doesn't absolve us of the problem of trying to absolve it. So we must recommit to rebuilding the American dream for all those who wish to work for it. Thank you.
Thank you, JoyAnn. Next was Paul.
Good. All right, thank you all for listening. I know this is a weighty topic and we went all over the place and we didn't even begin to scratch the surface of the actual topic, which is what to do about all this student debt. Joy makes the point that wealth seems to only come from wealth, which is counterfactual. There's many, many, many research articles, and a great book I recommend to you called The Millionaire Next Door, which goes through a lot of the research, the data that the average millionaire in America today started out in the bottom quintile. So there's a lot of upward mobility, and it didn't take a college education. Jack had said that high school education is insufficient to be successful today. Well, you should tell that to Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, because they never graduated from college. So all they had was a high school education. So that's just a false paradigm. The question is, what are we going to do about the current student debt problem? I don't think they've really addressed it, other than to say just somehow imagine it doesn't exist and write it off somewhere, charging other people for it. And we have a proposal to allow bankruptcy to be part of that process, to allow these loans to be priced to their risk of payback, and then to have the institution put some skin in the game and share that risk. And I think those are very, very solid proposals that will get us on the path towards fixing what is, we agree, a very serious problem. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for spending a short portion of your evening with us tonight, and thank you to Paul and Jimmy and JoyAnn and Ralph and the Humanists for taking the time to put this on. I want to close by sharing a story of two students that I've gotten to know over the years. Gerardo and Will are their first names. They were both incredibly talented undergraduate students who had to scrape by, taking out private loans, as much money they can from the federal government to go to college. And they both failed to go on to medical school despite being straight A students. That's because they simply couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford the opportunity cost of the time that it would take for them to be outside of school. They had a family to help support, and they just couldn't make it happen. And so when we talk about government intervention in education. It is so that every individual can realize their fullest potential. For many, many years, we as a country believed that elementary education and even a high school education were not necessary. It was only until the 1920s to the 1940s that we really universally expanded high school education in this country. The pace of innovation, the pace of change in the global economy demands that we continue to expand education for our citizens. If we do not, it will become at our peril. Cost, as I mentioned, is barring students from reaching their highest potential. Gerardo and Will were perfect examples of that. The market has also distorted educational incentives. You look at the major choices students are making, right? They're choosing to go into fields in medicine that are specialized because they know if they come out, they can make enough money to pay back their student loans. But we don't have enough teachers because we're not paying our teachers enough, because their costs of going to school to become a teacher is so high. We don't have enough standard pediatricians. We heard that example from Ralph at the beginning. From Bill Gates, the Bill Gates example is an interesting one. And the argument is made, well, Bill Gates didn't graduate from college. Well, he went to Harvard and he made a few connections there. That certainly helped. I visited Bill Gates High School personally. Lakeside High School outside of Seattle, Washington. It's a very wealthy school. They had one of the first computer mainframes on their campus, right? In the 1980s, Bill Gates had unfettered access to this incredible tool through his education, right? Think of what would have happened if we were able to extend to all students across the country access to those types of resources. Think of the human capital and the inventions that we would have today if we provided that access. And to the point that we're simply here to say that we want your money and we want to spend it the way we think is best. That money that we carry around, it's an illusion. It's fiat. It is backed by the full faith and confidence of the United States government. Without the government, there would be no money as we understand it. There would be a different medium of exchange, one significantly less valuable than the one we all carry in our pockets. So I advocate strongly for expanded higher education access because I believe in the ability of America to realize the potential of all of its individuals and all of its citizens. So thank you again for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful night.
So much to synopsize. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for joining us and participating, and to everyone who's been a part of this panel. I definitely would like to continue conversations and have open-ended invitations on the radio as well. I want to start by reading a quote. 1945 in the House of Commons, Winston Churchill noted, "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries." With that in mind, I say I absolutely agree with what Jack said about realizing the potential of the individual. I happen to believe that the role of each and every one of us and the role of government should be to unleash the unlimited potential of each and every individual. And a big way to do that is to get government off the backs of people. And one of the ways in which government intrudes oftentimes is regulations, others is taxation, others is structuring a system like the way the higher education system is today, or healthcare or other things, structuring it in a way that is fundamentally flawed and makes it more disadvantageous for the individual, and that frequently is because of the way in which government gets involved and how they structure things in their supposedly divine design. And I think that the example of Bill Gates at his high school is a really interesting one, because what that does show is that we do need more innovation in our K-12 system, and we do need to reevaluate how funding is allocated in our K-12 system, because it was in high school that Bill Gates was able to get that access to the innovative technology that made him then capable to go to college for a short while, drop out, and become now one of the top 3, I think he's now 3rd, maybe he's 2nd, richest people in the world. In other words, it is really the initiative of the individual and the creativity and the innovation of the individual that really, you can have all the knowledge in the world.
You can have access to all sorts of different things. But if you don't apply it, then you're not going to be successful. Now, nobody here on this stage suggested an action as well. I absolutely believe that we need action. In fact, as you'll see in my paper out there, I really believe that we need to fundamentally change how higher education is funded, how that's done. And as I proposed in the very beginning, I have a very specific way that I think we should be addressing the burdens of student loan debt as someone who for the last 8 years has been working diligently to pay it off and gone through some hardships at times, hence the forbearance mentioned from before. I think it's also important to note that we in the United States today, regardless of where you are on the economic spectrum just about, have the greatest standard of living in human history. That is truly the case. And also, earlier in this century, the United Nations put forward their Millennium Development Goals. We've reached that objective now. Human poverty on the globe, because of the unleashing of individual initiative, the success of capitalism over communism, has unleashed that unlimited potential of each and every individual all across the globe, and you can especially look in places like Africa and Asia where you've had much more ability, not always, but much more ability for the individual to prosper and thrive. Yes, our higher education system is absolutely warped these days, and yes, there is economic inequality that has expanded as a result. But it's because of the way since the 1970s, the way in which the government has structured this system. 1970, bottom quartile of families by income accounted for 12% of total bachelor's degrees received by age 24. 9.4% in 2010. I agree that economic inequality is exacerbated by this system. Where I disagree is that government is going to provide the roadmap for the future. Individual initiative and unleashing that is really going to be the key. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time. Look forward to meeting you outside.
Superb. That concludes our debate this evening. I would like to, again, give our 4 panelists a warm round of applause for putting all the effort that they did tonight and making for a great evening. So now it's time for you folks to vote. You've heard the arguments. We'd like to see if any of you changed your minds. The motion was use government funding and regulation to bring student debt down back to the levels of 1990. Yes, here we go, the count. Before the debate, the number of votes supporting the motion was 26. The number of votes against was 10. So that means we had 72% for, 28% against. After the debate, the number of votes for were 19. The number of votes against were 12. That means we had 60% for and 40% against. So that looks to me like the side that was against the motion gained 12 percentage points, and so I declare them the victors of the debate.
Everyone's
Well
a
done.
winner. We'll just redistribute, so 12%, 6%, 6%, it's a tie.
That's right. The true victory was civil discourse, and I thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Humanist event. Good night.